Welcome to the Deep Dive, our ongoing series mapping the really complex geography of the French and Indian War. We are navigating that whole struggle that, really defined the future of North America.
And just a quick note for you, the listener, if you haven't checked out the deep dives we've already done, the ones covering those early years, 1754 to 57 when France was really dominant, we highly, highly recommend catching up.
Oh, absolutely. That context is vital.
It is, because today we're not just talking about another battle, we're looking at the precise moment the entire war just fundamentally changed course.
That's right. For the British, those early years were, let's be honest, a catalog of failures. You had inept command, logistical nightmares, just disaster after disaster. Today, we're looking at that decisive turning point, the first real stroke of genius, you could say, for the new British command structure. The capture of the French fortress of Louisbourg in 1758.
Exactly. This deep dive is all about Louisbourg. We're going to get into its massive strategic importance, the painstaking preparations on both sides, and of course the key military leaders.
Including the meteoric rise of James Wolfe.
Oh, especially Wolfe. And then we'll get into the actual siege operations that delivered the victory. I mean, this event, it didn't just win a battle. It basically provided the blueprint for the entire conquest of New France.
It's the moment we formally shift from what historians call the years of defeat to the victorious years. And we'll see how this desperate French logistical crisis just collides head-on with a new, highly aggressive and centralized British strategy. It all culminates in a siege that really defined modern warfare at the time.
So to really get a handle on the scale of the British victory in 1758, we have to start by looking across the Atlantic right into the heart of New France, because the colony, it was suffering an existential crisis. It was fueled by starvation.
Right. New France wasn't just losing battles.
Yeah.
It was literally starving itself into submission. What was the core issue there? Was it an environmental disaster?
It was. It was two successive, just devastating crop failures, one in 1756 and then an even worse one in 1757.
Wow, back to back.
Back to back. And you have to think about it. This is a society that's almost entirely agrarian. It's focused on survival, and suddenly it loses 2 full years of its essential food base.
Well, this wasn't just a shortage.
No. This was an acute, systematic scarcity that threatened the entire social and military fabric of the colony.
And we have some incredible data that puts this crisis into, really sharp, painful perspective. Let's talk about the cost of this, starting with the price of wheat.
Right. So when food is scarce, prices just skyrocket.
Wow.
In a normal year, a minot of Canadian wheat, that's about 39 liters, it's the basic unit of grain. It would cost you maybe 4 or maybe 5 livres.
Okay, and a livre was basically what a day laborer would make.
Roughly, yes.
Yeah.
It was the basic unit of currency. So 5 livres for a staple unit of food was the standard rate.
So what happened by early 1758?
By January of 1758, the cost of that exact same minot had tripled. It was routinely selling for 15 livres.
15.
15. And even at that insane price, it was incredibly hard to even find someone willing to sell. We're talking about hyperinflation on the most critical resource you can imagine.
So the average person is spending 3 times as much money, if they even have it, just to get the same amount of grain. They're spending everything they have just to not starve.
Exactly. But, the hyperinflation, that's only half the story. The military had to step in and start rationing what little was left. And the actual amount of food available to civilians, it dropped to levels that are hard to even imagine.
Horrific levels.
It was horrific.
Yeah.
Since 1756, the authorities have been trying to stretch their grain by mixing flour with peas to make bread. But by that brutal winter of 1757-58, even that wasn't enough. The accounts from Quebec are just chillin'. By early April 1758, the daily bread ration for civilians was cut down to only 2 ounces.
2 ounces of bread a day. That's nothing. That's maybe a couple of slices of modern bread for an entire day.
It's basically the weight of 6 slices of bacon. It's a starvation diet. The body just can't function on that. This level of malnutrition led to widespread sickness, desperation. People were literally dying or becoming too weak to work, let alone fight.
And the only thing that stopped a total catastrophe was a supply convoy.
The only thing. A supply convoy from France finally arrived on May 20th, 1758, and it just narrowly averted total mass starvation in Quebec.
But that was only a temporary relief, right?
Yeah.
Because the military campaign season was starting, and the army needed those supplies more than the civilians.
Precisely. As soon as that convoy arrived, the government had to divert a huge portion of it to supply the army for the upcoming campaigns. The civilians barely saw any of it. By early June, the daily bread ration in Quebec had only gone back up to 4 ounces a day.
Still way, way below what you need to survive.
Far below subsistence. And you can see this pressure even the year before. Think about Montcalm's victory at Fort William Henry in 1757.
Right. It was a tactical victory, sure, but he had to withdraw his forces almost immediately, not just because of the infamous massacre, but because of an acute, immediate shortage of provisions. He literally had to release his Canadian militiamen so they could go home and try to salvage what was left of the harvest. New France was constantly fighting against the calendar and an empty pantry.
So Louisbourg, even before a single British ship appeared on the horizon, was already desperately short of food and reserves.
It was. So on one side, you have this. You have New France skilled officers, strong forts, but critically weak, starving, and supply-starved.
And on the other side, you have the new British power structure, engineered by William Pitt, launching what we now call the victorious years. It's the ultimate contrast.
It really is. Pitt's arrival signals a revolution in British strategic thinking. He centralized power, and he directed the war effort with this unprecedented personal intensity. He famously couldn't stand the Secretary at War, Viscount Barrington, and just bypassed the entire old military bureaucracy. He sort of built his own command structure, right? Like an early version of a general staff.
Exactly. He leaned heavily on Lord Anson, the first Lord of the Admiralty, who handled all the naval logistics, and Lord Ligonier, the commander-in-chief of the army, who was the strategic mind. Pitt himself was the engine room of this whole operation. His workload was legendary.
So he's micromanaging everything, sending orders directly to generals in the field.
He was, often completely bypassing the nominal commander-in-chief in North America, Major General Abercrombie.
Is that just micromanagement, or was he filling a vacuum? Was the system just that broken?
That's the core debate. I think Pitt saw the system as broken because it prioritized tradition and, who you knew over actual competence and logistics. By stepping in directly and bypassing figures like Abercrombie, who he probably saw as mediocre, he made sure that the resources went where they needed to go. He turned the war into a highly personalized projection of British fiscal and military might.
And his vision for 1758 was incredibly aggressive. Multi-pronged, designed to just stretch French resources to their absolute breaking point. What were the three big objectives?
His strategy was clear: hit the French everywhere, all at once. First, the New York theater, Ticonderoga. Second, the Ohio country, Fort Duquesne. And third, and this was the big one for sea power and getting into Canada, Louisbourg.
And attacking all three at the same time was key.
It was essential. It prevented the French from shifting their limited troops around to reinforce any single point that was in danger.
But an ambition like that requires a huge amount of manpower, and getting the colonies to cooperate had been a nightmare for previous commanders like Loudon. How did Pitt solve that problem?
This is where you see Pitt's political genius.
Yeah.
He connected Britain's economic strength directly to colonial self-interest. He didn't just demand troops. He offered a powerful financial guarantee. His policies promised parliamentary reimbursement for all colonial military spending.
So the Crown was footing the bill. Why was that so revolutionary?
It just removed the biggest obstacle, which was always taxation and who pays for what. Colonial assemblies, especially in places like Massachusetts, had always balked at funding large numbers of provincial troops. Pitt just cut that knot. If Parliament was going to pay them back, suddenly the colonies were more than willing. They were eager to join the fight.
And the result was... What kind of are we talking about?
The mobilization was historic. Within a month of the governors getting the news about Pitt's offer, the continental colonies collectively agreed to put over 23,000 provincials under arms.
23,000.
It was an unprecedented number. New England, which was always the backbone of colonial manpower, just poured men into the effort. Even places like Pennsylvania and New York, which had been reluctant before, they dramatically increased their military establishments.
So 23,000 provincials, funded by the Crown, fighting alongside thousands of British regulars. That's a military machine the French could never hope to match, not when they're dealing with the starvation crisis at home.
It completely changed the math of the war. The British went from being, in some cases, numerically inferior to having overwhelming manpower and really unparalleled financial resources backing every single campaign.
Okay, so let's zoom in on that main target, Louisbourg. Why was this fortress so absolutely essential? What did it guard?
Louisbourg was the lock on the door to Canada. It's on Ile Royale, which is modern-day Cape Breton Island, and it commanded the sea approaches to the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
So if you control Louisbourg...
You control the only sea route to the heart of New France. Quebec City. It was the major choke point. As long as Louisbourg stood, any major invasion of Canada by sea was basically impossible.
And the French knew this. They had reinforced it heavily.
Oh, absolutely. The French saw Louisbourg as their Gibraltar in the New World. Back in 1755, they'd sent 3,000 of their best-trained regulars under Baron de Dieskau, specifically to reinforce the garrisons at Quebec and Louisbourg. It was built to withstand a very long siege.
And for the British, capturing it was also about overcoming a psychological scar.
Yeah.
The failure there just the year before.
That's a crucial piece of this. In 1757, the Earl of Loudon and Admiral Holborn mounted a huge expedition against Louisbourg, but they were essentially paralyzed. They got there and found a massive French naval squadron, 18 ships of the line, and 5 frigates all gathered safely in the harbor.
Right, and they just called it off.
They called it off. Holborn decided the risk of attacking that fleet, with the fortress guns supporting them, was just too great. The entire expedition was abandoned. It was a humiliation.
So that failure proved that just having naval superiority wasn't enough.
Exactly. Pitt knew he needed an expedition that was not only massive, but was commanded by leaders who could pull off a perfectly coordinated land and sea assault. He needed to overcome both the fortifications and the humiliation of 1757.
The stage was perfectly set. The French are weak but dug in. The British are overwhelming, but they need flawless execution.
And the entire 1758 campaign would hinge on the ability of this new British command structure to succeed where the old guard had so spectacularly failed.
Okay, so Pitt has the money, he has the troops, a staggering number of them, and he has this aggressive three-pronged strategy. Now he needs the right people. And the command structure for Louisbourg, it reads like a who's who of the next 20 years of British military history.
It really does. The land forces were given to Major General Geoffrey Amherst, and his appointment was a huge leap of faith. It was a real sign that Pitt was prioritizing competence over seniority.
Where did Amherst come from? He wasn't a big name in London at the time.
No, not at all. He was relatively obscure. He was a colonel, and his job was running the commissariat for the Hessian mercenaries.
So he was a logistics guy.
He was a logistics guy for foreign troops fighting for Britain and Germany. He was basically plucked from a desk job and suddenly handed command of the largest British amphibious force ever assembled up to that point. It shows how much Pitt trusted his organizational skills.
And his actual journey to take command. It sounds like something out of a movie.
It was incredibly close. Amherst sailed from England on the Dublin, a powerful 74-gun warship. But its captain, a man named George Bridges Rodney, who later becomes a famous admiral, captured a French East Indiaman ship.
A prize ship.
A very rich prize ship. And Rodney, he wanted to take his valuable prize to safety in Vigo, which caused a huge delay.
A delay that could have cost Amherst the entire command.
It almost did. That delay, plus bad weather and heavy fog, meant that Amherst didn't arrive off Halifax until May 29, 1758. And this was the exact moment that the massive British Armada was already sailing out of the harbor.
You're kidding.
Nope. He literally had to transfer by boat from his ship to Admiral Boscawen's flagship in the middle of the ocean as the fleet was leaving. He assumed command mid-voyage.
Talk about a stressful start to a campaign. So who was the naval commander?
That was Admiral Edward Boscawen, known as Old Dreadnought. He commanded the whole Royal Navy Squadron. He was experienced, aggressive, and most importantly, his coordination with Amherst was a world away from the dysfunction we saw with Loudon and Holborn the year before.
And then there's the key division commander, a name we hear a lot in this war, Brigadier James Wolfe.
Wolfe's role at Louisbourg was his real proving ground. He was one of 3 brigadiers under Amherst. He was already known for his, let's say, his idiosyncratic intensity and his fierce ambition. This was his chance to really show off his skills in combined arms and light infantry tactics.
Skills that would become very important the next year at Quebec.
Paramount, yes.
It's just fascinating that Pitt didn't just pick the generals. He got into the weeds on logistics, which brings us to that incredible story about the carpenters.
This is maybe the best example of Pitt's obsessive centralized control. His orders for the Louisbourg expedition were minute. He insisted that Amherst hire a very specific person.
Not just a type of person, but one specific man.
One specific man. A master carpenter named Mr. Meserve from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to command a unit of 80 specialized carpenters.
Why does that one small detail tell us so much about Pitt's strategy?
Because it shows that Pitt understood, on a fundamental level, that this war was going to be won by superior engineering and logistics, not just by grand battlefield maneuvers. For a siege, you need huge amounts of lumber, for redoubts, for gun platforms, everything.
Right.
By personally demanding an experienced New England master carpenter, a guy who knew colonial wood and construction techniques, Pitt was bypassing the slow, often corrupt military contracting system and just ensuring that high-quality, specialized labor was ready to go on day one.
Is the difference between hoping for the best with local resources and guaranteeing you have an expert on site. He treated logistics like a weapon.
Exactly. He wasn't just worried about who led the army. He was worried about who built the bridges and who moved the guns. This meticulousness was the final piece of the puzzle.
And this extended to the naval strategy, too.
Absolutely. The naval superiority in 1758 was overwhelming, but it was also applied intelligently. The strategy shifted away from just seeking big naval battles and focused intensely on blockade and interdiction. Boscawen's fleet was there to make sure the French could never reinforce Louisbourg.
So they were strangling the fortress before the siege even began.
They were. By 1758, the French Navy was stretched to its limit. They were really reluctant to risk their remaining ships against the Royal Navy in open water. So while a few convoys got through to Quebec, that sustained British pressure meant Louisbourg's garrison was left completely isolated. There was no hope of reinforcement or resupply.
So we have the leaders, we have the resources, and the naval blockade is a success. Now we get to the actual assault.
Right. So the massive British fleet, we're talking 23 ships of the line, 18 frigates carrying 14,000 troops, arrives off Louisbourg. But the weather is just terrible. Fog, heavy seas. It delayed the landing for over a week.
That must have been torture, just sitting on those ships in rough seas, waiting.
It was. But it did give Amherst and his brigadiers time to plan their approach down to the last detail. The French, under Governor Drucour, they knew the landing would probably happen at Gabarus Bay, south of the fortress, so they'd set up strong defensive positions there.
So the landing, which finally happened on June 8th, it sounds like it was a textbook example of combined arms and psychological warfare.
It absolutely was. The British deployed in 3 divisions. 2 of them, under Brigadiers Whitmore and Lawrence, were ordered to make very obvious, very noisy feints.
Just a big distraction.
A huge distraction. They were rowing large numbers of boats aggressively towards the main French defenses. And the French troops, of course, they focused all their attention and their fire on these obvious threats, trying to guess where the main attack would come.
And while the French were distracted, Wolfe made the real move.
Wolfe commanded the 3rd Division. He targeted a small cove at the far end of the bay, a place the French considered too rough and rocky for a successful landing. It was called Lands à la Corne, and he didn't approach cautiously. As his boats crashed onto the shore, the French defenders finally realized what was happening, but it was just too late.
How quickly did they secure that beachhead?
It was a brutal, swift transition. The French had about 500 men from the regiment of Artois defending that specific spot. Wolfe's light infantry and grenadiers just rushed the shore, scrambling over the rocks, absorbing that initial volley of French fire. The sheer speed and determination was shocking to the defenders.
Shocking enough to break them completely.
It was. The French troops, they were outnumbered, they were caught off guard, and they were suddenly cut off from their retreat path back to the fortress. They just broke ranks and fled towards Louisbourg in total chaos. Within hours, a French report lamented that several thousand of English soldiers had been landed and drawn up in battle array. By noon that day, the entire beachhead was secure, and 4,000 to 5,000 British troops were pouring ashore.
There's that famous quote from the captured French grenadier captain, which really sums up the whole thing.
It really does. He reportedly called Wolfe's attack desperate and presumptuous, and admitted that no people in the world but the British troops would have attempted and carried it.
It wasn't just courage, it was the psychological shock of it.
Exactly. And you have to remember the French defenders were already weak from months of short rations. So once the troops were ashore, Amherst halted just outside the range of the fortress guns, and the siege began in earnest. But it was clear from the start this was going to be a land operation.
Right, because Amherst wanted Admiral Boscawen to just sail into the harbor and end it quickly.
He did, but Boscawen refused. He was aggressive, but he wasn't reckless. He'd surveyed the harbor defenses, and they were formidable. The entrance was narrow, and the fortress guns were perfectly positioned to deliver devastating, close-range fire on any ship that tried to get in.
And there was a physical barrier too, right?
Yes. The French had also built a log and chain boom across the harbor entrance the year before. Boscawen just calculated that risking his massive fleet against fixed defenses that couldn't miss was too great a risk to the Royal Navy, especially when a land victory was achievable, even if it was slower. so the siege would be won by the engineers.
Which meant the burden fell entirely on the army. But before they could even approach the main walls, they had to deal with a key secondary objective.
That was Lighthouse Point, on the north side of the harbor entrance. Amherst gave that critical task to Wolfe, along with 1,400 men. The French had a strong battery there, and their guns were harassing the landing site and complicating the movement of British ships.
And Wolfe was the perfect guy for that kind of flanking attack.
He was. He excelled at speed and light infantry tactics. It took him 2 weeks, but he successfully moved his troops, secured the high ground, and started building his own batteries.
Ah, so they turned the tables.
Completely. Once Wolfe's guns-heavy 32-pounders were operational, they were able to silence the French island battery and suppress most of the fire coming from the harbor. This neutralized the threat to the Navy and freed up the engineers to start the mainland assault.
So with that flank secure, they could focus on the western landward approach. What did that grueling process look like?
This was classic siege warfare. Slow, deliberate, and bloody. The British engineers started building 3 main redoubts, or forward earthworks, on the western side of the fortress, and they were working under constant fire.
So this isn't just digging one long trench towards the wall.
No, it's a series of parallel trenches and communication lines. You zigzag your way closer and closer. The engineers would use things like fascines, which are bundles of sticks, and gabions, wicker baskets filled with dirt, to build protective walls while they dug.
And the French are firing at them the whole time.
The whole time. And they're also conducting frequent sorties or counterattacks, trying to disrupt the digging. They knew that if the British artillery got close enough, their stone walls wouldn't last. But the sheer mass of British manpower just meant the siege lines kept creeping forward day after day.
So what were the final moments that broke the French will to resist?
It was a combination of things in late July. First, the sustained British artillery fire was inflicting continuous damage on the main King's Bastion. Second, the Royal Navy, even without entering the harbor, managed to destroy the French warships trapped inside. On July 21st, British shelling set fire to the French ship l'Entreprenant.
And that fire spread.
It blew up, and the explosion spread fire to 2 other warships. In one catastrophic event, the trapped French fleet was basically wiped out.
So any hope of naval relief or escape was gone.
Completely gone. And finally, the mainland batteries got so close that their heavy fire just started systematically reducing the main defenses to rubble. The walls were breached, the fleet was gone, the garrison was exhausted. Governor Drucour knew it was pointless to resist any longer.
And after nearly 2 months of this, the fortress capitulated.
On July 26, 1758, Louisbourg surrendered. The British took control of the fortress, all its supplies, and for the first time, they had secured the vital gateway to the St. Lawrence River.
The fall of Louisbourg. I mean, it was immediately seen as a strategic masterpiece, a huge morale boost for the British Empire. What was the most profound, immediate impact it had on the war in North America?
The immediate impact was that it completely changed the calculus of invading Canada. The capture of Louisbourg confirmed, beyond any doubt, that Britain now had undisputed command of the sea lanes.
Before this, Quebec was safe because Louisbourg was guarding the front door.
Exactly. And now Quebec was exposed. This loss basically condemned New France to a slow death by logistical isolation.
So it wasn't just a victory, it was the creation of a base.
Yes.
A secure, deep-water naval base from which they can launch the next phase.
Right. From this point on, the Royal Navy could stage, resupply, and launch expeditions, like the massive one for the 1759 Quebec campaign, directly into the St. Lawrence. The threat to the British colonies was gone, replaced by an overwhelming threat to the French capital.
And it immediately validated Pitt's whole strategy. Centralization, financial commitment, coordinated land-sea power. It proved that it worked.
It did. The blueprint was set. Overwhelming financial power leads to overwhelming troop deployment, supported by flawless logistics and decisive naval superiority. This campaign formally closed the chapter on the British years of defeat.
And beyond that, the siege itself acted as this high-pressure proving ground for officers who would go on to shape military history for decades.
This is one of the most interesting long-term implications. The siege elevated officers based on pure performance, not just rank. We've already talked about the star of the show, James Wolfe. His success at Lighthouse Point proved he could handle independent command in incredibly dangerous situations.
And that paid off directly the very next year at Quebec.
It did. Wolfe was so impressed by one of his brigadiers at Louisbourg, a man named William Howe, who commanded a light infantry battalion, that he gave Howe the key command at Quebec.
It was Howe who led the group that scaled the cliffs.
It was Howe who led the detachment that scaled the cliffs at Lenonceau-Foulon, securing the Plains of Abraham for the battle. So you can draw a direct line from the command dynamic forged at Louisbourg to the victory at Quebec.
And the overall commander, Jeffrey Amherst, his reputation became so sterling that it lasted long after this war was over.
It did. Amherst's competence at Louisbourg led to him becoming the commander-in-chief in North America. And that reputation endured so powerfully that in 1775, when the American colonies revolted, the British government immediately offered him the job of commander-in-chief of all British forces to put down the rebellion.
Wow. And did he accept?
He firmly declined. Amherst had worked so closely with colonial troops and governments during the French and Indian War that he said he had a deep reluctance to fight against the Americans.
That's incredible. It shows how deep those connections forged during the war really were.
It does. His personal ethics won out over the highest possible military command.
So the Louisbourg's victory wasn't a solitary event. It was the essential maritime piece of Pitt's synchronized plan for 1758. How did it connect to the other two campaigns, Ticonderoga and the Ohio Valley?
Well, if Louisbourg was the sea gate, then the capture of Fort Frontenac was the key that choked the interior's logistical artery. Colonel John Bradstreet led a force of provincials on a fast campaign against Fort Frontenac right at the mouth of Lake Ontario.
Why was Frontenac so crippling to the French?
Because it was the crucial transshipment point for all supplies moving from Montreal up the St. Lawrence and into the Great Lakes network. It fed all the French forts in the Ohio Valley, especially Fort Duquesne. Bradstreet's capture just severed that vital line.
So Louisbourg cuts Canada off from Europe, and Frontenac cuts the French interior forts off from Canada, which brings us to the third target, Fort Duquesne.
Precisely. At the same time, General John Forbes was leading this methodical, grueling march towards Duquesne. And the French garrison there was already weak because Montcalm had pulled men back to Canada to defend against the threat of invasion after Louisbourg fell.
And without the supplies from Frontenac, the Duquesne garrison was doomed to starve, just like the civilians in Quebec.
It was a chain reaction. By late 1758, the French commander at Duquesne wrote that unless he sent men away immediately, he'd only have provisions for about 10 days. So when Forbes's advance forces, including a young George Washington, approached in late November, the French garrison was demoralized, starving, and totally cut off.
And rather than face a siege they couldn't possibly win, they just abandoned it.
They burned it and abandoned it on November 25, 1758. So you have this triple success: Louisbourg at the sea gate, Frontenac on the supply route, and the resulting abandonment of Duquesne in the Ohio Valley. This is why 1758 was the Annus Mirabilis, the year of miracles. It was the foundation for the entire conquest.
And this successful blueprint, this reliance on sheer financial and logistical muscle, it brings us back to our big question for you, the listener. We talked about the dire poverty and starvation in New France, or the 2 bread rations, the skyrocketing prices. If you contrast that structural weakness with the immense financial backing from Pitt, mobilizing over 23,000 troops, funding this overwhelming naval presence, how much did that huge economic and logistical gap prefigure the ultimate outcome of the entire war?
It really raises the question, doesn't it? Was the conquest of Canada inevitable once Britain, under Pitt, decided to fully commit its national wealth to the war? Did the military skill of men like Montcalm ever really stand a chance against an enemy that could essentially just afford to starve them into submission?
The ultimate battle may not have been won with muskets, but with the treasury and the supply wagon. That's a huge question to think about as we wrap up this deep dive on the Louisbourg victory. A success that gave Britain the strategic certainty it needed to launch the final phase of the war.
Next time, however, we're going to delve into the complexities of that same pivotal year, 1758, and contrast this shining maritime victory with a brutal land-based disaster. The disaster at Ticonderoga.
Ah, yes. A crucial reminder that even during the victorious years, success was never guaranteed.
Not at all. We'll see how, despite having all the resources in the world, poor command decisions led to a crushing defeat and the tragic death of the very highly esteemed Lord Howe.
Thank you so much for joining us for this extensive deep dive into the capture of Louisbourg.
If you enjoyed this exploration of strategy and logistics, please subscribe and leave us a like. We'll see you next time as we explore the disaster at Ticonderoga.